Chapter 28: Generalization and Maintenance of Behavior Change. Generality of behavior change is one of the 7 defining characteristics of applied behavior analysis that you covered, I believe, in ABA 601 in the article by Bayer, Wolf, and Risley. Generalization looks at 3 important facets: that's time, setting, and behaviors. Response maintenance is when the learner continues to exhibit the behavior after intervention has been discontinued. So one example could be, and this is noted in your textbooks on page 617, is a student who was taught to write down his assignments and keep materials for each class in separate folders. And as he graduates and moves on, and now he's a sophomore in college, he continues to apply these organizational skills to his academic work. Setting or situation generalization is when the learner can exhibit those behaviors that were learned in the instructional setting to a different setting. And oftentimes that's the actual applied setting. When we're thinking about generalization, there's 2 different settings. The first one is the instructional setting, and this is the environment in where you're teaching the skills that you want them to apply in the generalization setting. And that can be, where you want them to perform the target behavior. So some examples would be the instructional setting would be raising your hand when the special education teacher asks a question in the resource room. And the generalization setting might be the student raising their hand when the general education teacher asks a question in the regular classroom. Another example could be practicing conversational skills with a speech therapist at school. And then the generalization setting would be talking with peers on the playground or out in the community. Response generalization is when the learner can exhibit an untrained behavior that has the same function as the trained target behavior. So that could be, teaching somebody to write down phone messages, and instead of pushing play on the answering machine and writing down the message, maybe they've then learned to use a tape recorder or send a text message to send that message to somebody. So it could look different, like the topography, but the function is still the same, which is recording a message and passing it on. Generalization is a relative concept. It exists along a continuum, and that means that some interventions can produce a great deal or amount of generalized behavior change. So that's saying that after we've terminated the intervention, the learner can now, emit or exhibit all these different target behaviors and several functionally related behaviors that were not necessarily taught. And then some of them can be very limited. So you've, taught the intervention, you've taught them how to generalize, but now it's still just very specific. And if, one thing changes that they weren't taught, that might need additional training itself. And the 3 forms of generalized behavior can occur in isolation of one another or in combination with each other. So again, we're looking at across time, across settings, and across behaviors. Many of you have heard of the term overgeneralization. Basically, the definition is when the behavior that we've taught comes under stimulus control that's too broad. So, one example might be we've taught a child to identify what a dog is, and now every 4-legged creature is a dog, right? So they've learned to respond in the presence of different stimuli, but it's not always appropriate. Faulty stimulus control is when that target behavior comes under very restricted stimulus control or something that's irrelevant. So for an example could be like when we teach our students to respond to certain bells, right? This is an example that I like to use. And there's, like the fire drill, there's the earthquake drill, there's the recess bell, right? So faulty stimulus control could be that they've learned that when the recess bell rings, they stop, they freeze, they put their hands on their head, right? We see that a lot on different playgrounds. Faulty stimulus control could be that they hear maybe the fire drill or an earthquake drill, and then they exhibit that same behavior. So it definitely wouldn't work in a situation where we need students to kind of cooperate and fall in line, and go to the field, right? So that would be faulty stimulus control. So I know in chapter 17, you guys talked a lot about stimulus equivalence, but I'll just briefly review it. So basically, that's saying you were trained to a specific stimulus, and then it could have been paired with maybe a neutral stimulus, and then eventually that neutral stimulus had the same effect or elicited that same behavior as the trained stimulus, right? So basically it's saying like these stimuli have been paired and now they're equivalent and they elicit the same types of behaviors. Contingency adduction is a new term. So that's where a behavior that was initially selected and shaped under one set of conditions is then recruited by a different set of contingencies and takes on a new function in a person's repertoire. So I kind of struggled with finding examples of these, but one example might be if you guys have watched Karate Kid, right, where they do wax on, wax off, right? So initially wax on, wax off is part of the training and to kind of like, work on his concentration or fighting skills or whatever. Well, contingency adduction would be taking that same type of behavior and then using it in a different setting with a different function. Another example would be, I don't know how accurate this is, but, sometimes football players will take ballet or they'll have them do some ballet, right? So ballet in that setting has a different function, but then that's supposed to transfer over to the field, right? Where they then use those skills that they learned in a different type of function with playing football. Another one is occupational therapy, right? So in an OT setting, in a therapy setting, they're doing different exercises. One might be, hiding things in the Play-Doh and then pulling it apart to find that really small object to work on their fine motor skills. And then that's supposed to transfer over with a different set of contingencies and serve a different function to maybe writing with the appropriate grasps. Hopefully that makes sense. So generalized outcomes require planning. So I think oftentimes we forget to plan for how we're going to teach generalization of specific skills. So one important thing to do is select behaviors that will meet natural contingencies of reinforcement. So those are things that are actually in the learner's environment and something that they'll continue to maintain based on their settings and their environment. You want to make sure you specify all the desired variations of the behavior and then the setting or situations in which they will or maybe will not have to use that behavior once instruction has ended or teaching for that behavior is ended. So if you're thinking about, toileting skills, what could those different settings look like, right? The target behaviors should be selected very carefully. So there's different criteria that they suggest. One is that making sure that the skill and the degree of independence for the skill is actually very age appropriate. So what would be typical for that learner in their environment? The most important criterion is remembering that behavior is functional to the learner. So sometimes there are skills that, the teacher would like to have them learn or the parent, and maybe that could be a preference. But again, considering that skill has to be functional for them. And then again, they have to be very reinforced in their setting and make contact with that reinforcement in order for that behavior to be maintained. On page 56, they talk about relevance of behavior rule as mentioned in this 1968 article by Alon and Azrin. And that rule is basically saying to choose behaviors that will produce reinforcers in the post-intervention environment. So that's saying the same thing, right? You want to make sure the skill that you're teaching is going to make contact with natural reinforcers after intervention has been terminated, right? So is this something that they can maintain on their own? And then Bayer in 1999 wrote that as a rule for practitioners, we should also kind of follow this rule. So it's a good rule to not make any deliberate behavior changes that will not meet natural communities of reinforcement. And as I mentioned before, naturally existing contingency is any contingency of reinforcement or possibly punishment that's independent of the behavior analyst or practitioner's effort. So that means it's not socially mediated. So an example in the textbook is when somebody slips and falls on ice, right? So that's not socially mediated. They've learned that next time maybe I shouldn't walk on the ice, or I need to be more careful based on that quote unquote punishment. A contrived contingency is any contingency of reinforcement or punishment that's been designed and implemented by a practitioner. And this is often used when we're teaching the skill, right? It's something that they're like opportunities that we create in order to teach the skill and for the learner to practice the skill. Make sure to list all the behaviors that need to be changed. And again, being very specific and operationally defining everything. List all the settings and situations in which you want those behavior to occur or to not occur. And then in the textbook on page 625, they list pre-intervention planning. So 6 stated possible benefits by Bayer in 1999. And again, you can find this in your text. I'll just kind of briefly review them. The first one is that you see the full scope of the problem ahead. The second is if you teach less than the full scope of the problem, that would be the practitioner's choice. And then thinking about, the possibilities if we're not teaching to the full scope of the problem behavior. If less than a complete teaching program results in less than a complete set of behavior changes, don't be surprised. You can decide to teach less than there is to learn, perhaps because that's all that is practical or possible to do. Number 5, you can decide what is most important to teach. You can also decide to teach the behavior in a way that encourages indirect development of other desired behaviors and indirect occurrence of the behavior in other desired situations that you can't teach directly. And then if you choose the option discussed in number 5, rather than doing a very complete, thorough program, you do that knowing that the desired outcome might not be desirable, right? So there's going to be some missing links or holes, and then you should plan for those if we aren't going to, plan for a very detailed generalization plan. Some strategies and tactics to promote generalized behavior change, and we'll go into each one of these in more detail in the following slides, is teach the full range of relevant stimulus conditions and response requirements. So all the different types of stimuli and the different types of responses. Make the instructional setting similar to the generalization setting. Maximize a target behavior's contact with reinforcement in the generalization setting. Mediate generalization, and then train to generalization. In generalization, you want to teach the full range of relevant stimulus conditions and response requirements. So that's saying you want to teach the learner the different types of stimuli they might see in the environment, and then the different types of behaviors. So I like to use, using the bathroom or washing your hands. So a lot of times we're teaching our students how to kind of go through that task analysis. So if you think about washing your hands, there's different types of sinks, right? And then with those different types of sinks, there's different ways. So the behavior will look a little bit different, but the function is still they're washing their hands. A general case analysis is also known as a general case strategy, and that's basically a systematic method for selecting teaching examples that represent the full range of the different types of stimuli and then the different types of responses in a generalization setting. And then a negative what is this called? A negative or don't do it teaching example. So you want to, again, you're teaching every possible condition or situation, but then you're also teaching them when they would not exhibit that behavior. The goal is to teach every desired form of the target behavior in every setting or situation and that they might need it. I know sometimes that's not possible or practical. You might think that you've planned for everything and then something unexpected comes up. But when we do this to the best of our ability, it would decrease the amount of time that we would need to generalize or to program for response generalization. So again, you're really just teaching them to respond to all different types of stimuli and learn the different types of behaviors they can exhibit. So teaching sufficient examples, as I've mentioned before, you're going to teach the learner to respond to a subset of all the possible stimuli, all the possible response examples, and then you can assess their learning by kind of probing or a generalization probe of untrained examples. So in teaching sufficient stimulus examples, the general rule is that you want to make sure during the teaching or instruction time that you're teaching as many different types of examples as possible, right? We kind of discussed that already. And the actual number of examples needed will vary across, how complicated the behavior is, what types of teaching procedures you're using, how many opportunities can they actually use that behavior in different conditions or different settings. Are they naturally existing contingencies of reinforcement for the learner? And then their history of reinforcement for when they have actually generalized behaviors in the past. It's important to practice with a variety of response topographies, and that will help to increase the rate of generalization. And then do what we call multiple exemplar training. So just as I mentioned before, it's teaching the learner all the different types of stimuli that they might see, and then the different types of responses to meet the same function of that behavior. I kind of touched on this one earlier, but a general case analysis. So that's a systematic method for selecting teaching examples, and that makes sure that it represents the full range or all the possible stimulus variations and response variations in the generalization setting. It's also known as a general case strategy. So in your textbook, they talk about a study. And long story short, basically for that particular behavior, they were able to list out, this type of stimulus and this type of response. And if they came up with multiple ones, they tried to figure out about how many possible combinations, right? So stimulus 1 versus response requirement 1, stimulus 2 versus response requirement 1, and response requirement 2. So it came up to be like maybe 16 different combinations using this general case analysis. Negative teaching examples is where you explicitly teach them when you would not exhibit the target behavior, right? And you actually practice when you don't do it. And this is good because it actually sharpens the stimulus control. So in the past, you've talked about the SD versus the S delta. So this is kind of like the S delta, right? So you exhibit the behavior under different stimuli and you don't get that reinforcement. Another strategy is making the instructional setting similar to the generalization setting. And there's two ways to do that, which we'll talk about in more detail in the following slides. The first one is program common stimuli. So include those features in the generalization setting in the teaching setting, and then teaching loosely. And that's randomly varying other aspects of the instructional setting within and across the teaching setting. Some advantages for programming common stimuli is that sometimes in the generalized setting, you can't always practice all of the different scenarios. Also, safety reasons. So if you're teaching them how to cross the street, right? Things like that. So those are some skills you might want to focus on in the instructional setting, and then make sure you're programming like maybe the street signs or the stop signs, things like that. And so it allows for it to be safer. You can kind of control for certain variables that you can't control in the natural setting. Programming common stimuli is a two-step process. So the first step is to identify, when they say salient, what are those common things that you would see in the generalized setting, and then making sure that once you've identified those, that you're incorporating those into the instructional setting. Some of the benefits for what they call teaching loosely, and we'll go through some of the recommendations in the later slides, is that it reduces the likelihood that the client or the student or the learner will overgeneralize, right? Because depending on how you're teaching a skill, they might overgeneralize and only respond to those specific things that were in the learning environment. So, some suggestion that Bayer makes in his 1999 article, and I'm sure many of you guys use these already while you're teaching your learners, is you want to use two or more teachers. So, maybe in some of your settings, it's two or more therapists, right? So, then they're generalizing across people. You want to teach in two or more places, right? So, again, that could be the instructional setting, maybe in different rooms of the house or different areas of the classroom, right? So it's more than just the instructional setting and the generalized setting. It says to teach from various positions. So that can mean a lot of things. So it could be where you're placing the stimuli, your proximity to the student, vary your tone of voice. So sometimes when we're giving the SD or the instruction, we're only giving it in one tone. Or maybe sometimes we give the instruction in a very like sing-songy voice, right? So being mindful of that you want it to be a tone that they will most likely hear in their learning settings or in their generalized settings. Vary your choice of words. So sometimes it's give me this. You want to make sure that you're using different instructions. So show me the item, or where is the item that you want them to identify. Show stimuli from a very variety of angles. So that could be those positional prompts. Have others present the instruction, and then vary your reinforcers. And then these are other suggestions. Again, I would use these at your discretion if it's appropriate. If you find that they're too distracting for your learners, you don't have to do them. But teaching in various lighting conditions, different noise levels, this is vary decorations, furniture, and their locations, vary the times of day of for training sessions, vary the temperature, vary the smells, and then vary the content of what's being taught.